Welcome one and all, I am Josh Rivers, and this one's a little overdue, if I'm honest, cause Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice has been on my worth mentioning to-do list for quite some time. When developer Ninja Theory promised to offer AAA production value without relying on a AAA publisher, I was interested from the word go, particularly because I could very easily see that fabled mid-tier of game development becoming my niche, its contemporary sensibilities rendering it a prospective haven from the endless cavalcade of late 80s to early 90s nostalgia trips that has, by this point, thoroughly alienated me, but its status as an independent game not beholden to a big money publisher like EA or Activision Blizzard would also protect it from being mired in the filth of current AAA practices. With that in mind, I was over the moon when I heard recently that Hellblade was performing significantly better than its developers expected, hitting the break-even point after just 3 months. A full 6 months sooner, that's half a year for those keeping score, than it was expected to. That level of success is undeniably significant, and with it, Hellblade has proven a crucial point. That without the assistance of a publisher, a game can look this good, have this level of visual fidelity, can deliver AAA levels of polish, and yet launch at half the typical AAA asking price. Without any microtransactions, any season passes, any endless, nebulous lists of special editions, any bloody loot boxes. All of the stuff that AAA publishers shoehorn into all of their games crying, "Oh, but they're so expensive to make, we need the extra revenue." Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice can have none of that, have the same level of visual fidelity and polish, launch at half the price, and still only need to sell 500,000 copies to start making its money back. Which it can do. 3 times quicker than expected. Kind of makes you wonder how the people at EA and Square Enix got their jobs. But fear not, corporate apologists, that's not the main point of today's video. Instead, I wanted to talk about something that I've kind of been umming and ahhing over weighing into for a while. If you listen to the Indie Haven podcast, you may already know this, but I have schizophrenia. A mental illness that can cause psychosis, psychosis being what the main character Senua suffers from. Most of my symptoms are very mild. There are a handful of them that are less mild, shall we say? But for example, I've never experienced any visual hallucinations. I've experienced the occasional auditory hallucination, but they're always very slight, very non-intrusive. But because of the very mild nature of a lot of my symptoms, I've been kind of reluctant to weigh in on Hellblade's depiction of psychosis. Because there are many aspects of psychosis and living with it that I have no personal experience of. And with something as intimate as the workings of the human mind, personal experience is really the only thing you can put any stock in. But obviously I'm here doing this now, and to be honest I feel like I kind of owe it to myself to be here doing this now because, I mean, sitting here invalidating my own mental illness doesn't exactly seem like the healthiest thing in the world. Mental illness isn't some sort of checklist that you have to live up to in order for your experiences to count. It's incredibly complex and deeply personal. People's symptoms will vary. My experience of having a psychotic disorder might not be 100% identical to what's depicted in Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, but neither will a lot of people's. And that itself is really important to bring up. See, it can be argued that Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is supposed to be an empathy tool to give people who don't experience psychosis a reference point for what it's like to have it. And in order to create that understanding, it kind of becomes necessary to run the gamut of every possible effect that psychosis can have on you. And honestly, fundamentally that logic is sound. But it's also the crux of what's wrong with Hellblade's representation of psychosis. Not the fact that they're trying to represent all of these different experiences, but the fact that they're trying to do it using only one character. While she has to exist as the player's sole point of reference for what psychosis is like, Senua is not so much a character with psychosis as she is an aggregate. A collation of everything the writers know about psychosis and every symptom they associate with it, crammed together to form one extreme case. An extreme case that the audience is going to be led to believe represents everyone with psychosis. In trying to represent everyone, Senua's only really representing the few who have the most extreme cases. But neurotypical society isn't equipped to make that distinction. Its definitions are too rigid, it has no appreciation for greyness, for variability. It works almost exclusively in binaries, everything has to be black and white, set in stone. And so if you don't tick all the boxes, if you don't live up to the popular understanding of any given mental illness, then as far as they're concerned, you don't have that mental illness. Your mental health ends up getting trivialized, leaving you to go decades sometimes without an explanation for what you're experiencing, blaming yourself for it just for lack of anything else to blame. And that's not just speculation, I'm talking from personal experience. I myself didn't realise I had schizophrenia, or depression, or anxiety until I was like 20, because my version of it wasn't as extreme as the ones that I'd always been shown growing up. I didn't realise schizophrenia could be more subtle than that. I assumed it would be obvious to everyone if I had it. I didn't have the most extreme version of it, ergo I didn't have it at all, and so I was left with no other explanation than I was acting up. I was being weak. My mental health issues became my fault. All because of the inflexible way that mental health is invariably represented. 'Cause, I guess, from a purely cynical standpoint, it's got to be dramatic, it's got to elicit an emotional response, because evidently we all got together at some point and agreed that shock was a valid substitute for empathy. And that inability to process anything other than extremes, that culture of zero-sum diagnosis, is incredibly unhealthy. Not just because of the way it trivializes certain people's mental health issues, but also just for the way it skews people's perceptions of mental health as a concept. And as someone who's been affected by it in both of those ways, I'd quite like it to stop. So yeah, trying to sum up the entirety of Psychosis using only one character wasn't the best move. And depending on how charitable you're feeling, you could describe it as anywhere from naive to downright irresponsible. And what makes it all the more galling is the fact that everything you need to fix that problem is already in the game. Because while Senua is ostensibly the player's sole point of reference for what psychosis is like, she's not the only character in the game who has psychosis. Senua's mother experiences psychosis. Druth, it's implied, experiences hallucinations. And it could be argued that the paranoid delusions which shape the imagery of the world of Hellblade were Druth's before they were Senua's. Or at the very least he clearly understands paranoid delusion enough that he can influence its symbolism to effectively guide Senua through her own healing process. Both of these characters were already in the game, they were already at the disposal of the writers. But they're just not used. We don't spend enough time with either of them. Senua's mother in particular is barely in the game at all. And in what little time we do spend with her, her own experiences of psychosis are barely mentioned. Druth gets slightly more fleshed out, but ultimately he is just there to tutorialize, to contextualize the world that Senua is experiencing. Because ultimately that's all any other character in this game is. They're just context for Senua. They all only exist in the context of the influence they've had on Senua. We only ever see them through her lens, and that's not exactly helped by the fact that they're all dead before the story even begins. But even just existing as memories, those characters could still have been more. You'd barely have to change anything. You wouldn't even have to change anything about Senua or her symptoms, just so long as you added in those other points of reference using characters you already had, in order to give the player a wider, more diverse, more accurate base of reference for what psychosis is. You could have Senua's mother talk about her own experiences at all. Instead of just explaining environmental puzzles, you could have had Druth go deeper into the symbolism behind them, discuss how the imagery pertains to him. You could have had it transpire that everything Senua experiences during Hellblade Senua's sacrifice is an elaborate symbolic healing exercise that Druth is able to guide her through because he's been through it himself. An idea I would have found particularly awesome because using symbolic constructs as coping mechanisms is something I actually do, but that doesn't happen. None of what I just described happens. And thus we find ourselves with the problem of Senua acting as the sole point of reference for something a single point of reference could never accurately represent on its own. And it's just frustrating to know that that problem could have been solved with the slightest, most superficial of changes. The potential was right there under their noses, and it seems so obvious to me. But then again, I'm not neurotypical. That's the other thing. People who suffer from psychosis were consulted, but ultimately they're not the ones who made the game. It's based on their accounts as understood by a neurotypical creative team. And that fact has very clearly left its mark on the end product. The game is littered with ideas that have been lost in translation. Things based in truth made to feel false by that crucial lack of first-hand understanding. One of the more hilarious examples of this is Hellblade's depiction of Pareidolia? Pareidolia? Pareidolia. It's the phenomenon whereby you see patterns where none exist, like seeing Jesus' face in a burnt bit of toast. It's a creative process that everyone actually engages in on some level, but in particular, people with psychosis have more of a predisposition towards it and will often pick up on patterns that other people might miss. Now, there is a point in the game where it is very heavily signposted that there are going to be faces hidden somewhere in the environment. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, they're going to have things that look vaguely like faces blended subtly into the environment. Perhaps a formation of rocks when looked at from a certain angle, or a certain damp patch on a wall somewhere. See, that's a fascinating idea. I wonder how they're gonna... Oh, I mean, I guess they had to make them obvious so that the neurotypical people in the audience could actually see them. But Jesus Christ. Now, I engage in Pareidolia? Pareidolia, whatever it's called, I engage in it a lot. Particularly in low light when it's in a position to scare the piss out of me. But, in case there was any confusion, I've never seen that. Unless Mount Rushmore's not real. Now that example was comical, in my opinion anyway, but this next one is just kind of infuriating. In fact, it was a move that garnered quite a bit of ire from both players and critics alike. And indeed, if you've heard of Hellblade prior to watching this, chances are you already know exactly what I'm referring to. So then, the Black Rot. Early in the game, Senua is afflicted with what's referred to as the Black Rot, which engulfs her right hand. And the game tells you that every time Senua dies, the Black Rot will grow, creeping further up her arm until it reaches her head. And when it reaches her head, the game will be over, and you will lose all of your progress. Permadeath. It's a concept that turned a lot of people off buying and playing the game. It's also a complete lie. There is no permadeath, your progress doesn't get deleted, and to be honest, I haven't even seen the rot creep up Senua's arm outside of scripted cutscenes. In fact, I've actually seen it shrink. The game outright lies to you. And people were understandably annoyed. Now, I think this was supposed to be an allegory for paranoid delusion, but it's not a very good one. You see, paranoid delusion actually works kind of like pareidolia. It's an extrapolation of patterns and connections that in actuality don't exist. I'll give you an example from my own life, and before anyone says anything, I fucking know it's not real. Alright? So shut up in advance. It doesn't happen so much these days, but on occasion I will feel a presence behind me. And this presence will often manifest itself as a giant, nightmarish, jet black werewolf-like creature, all claws and teeth and jutting bones. Now, I never saw, heard or felt this creature, but I just sort of knew it was there, and somehow knew that it was a giant black werewolf. That's the important detail. I never saw it, but I somehow knew exactly what it looks like. That's how paranoid delusion works. It takes the slightest, vaguest stimulus and spins it out into this elaborate thing that you suddenly know everything about, based on nothing, based on zero tangible evidence. What you don't get is reams of glowing text telling you explicitly that there is a giant fuck-off werewolf behind you and he's gonna claw absolute fuck out of you. This is not a demonstration of paranoia at work. This is an explicit instruction from a video game that the audience has no reason to disbelieve. It is a base lie, pure and simple. You know what would have been a better representation of paranoid delusion? If the game just hadn't said what the black rot was. If they had just introduced it and said, right, this is going to creep up your arm until it reaches your head, and then said nothing further, and just left players to speculate. And oh, would the players speculate. I'm thinking back to Dark Souls 3, when it was discovered that one of the character stats, poise, didn't work the same way that it did in previous titles, but the developers never actually confirmed what the difference was. I think someone did eventually figure it out, but at the time I remember seeing a whole range of weird theories based on anecdotal evidence. I remember looking at a forum full of people going, well, I equipped an item that gave me higher poise and this happened, so maybe it does that. Maybe that's what it changes. It must do. I mean, I've seen it happen, so that must be what it is. Isn't it? Now, I'm aware that right now I'm describing superstition rather than paranoia, but when you apply that to a psychological horror like Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, a game where people are already expecting it to mess with them, a game that already has its players on edge, and then you introduce the black rot as this unexplained thing that spreads upon the character's death, something that only ever changes in response to a negative outcome. That is how you make people feel paranoia. Maybe in practice what I'm suggesting isn't the best idea, and in fact by now I wouldn't be surprised to hear that someone's already suggested better, but I hope we can at least agree that it would have been better than what was actually done, both in terms of accuracy in representing paranoia and in terms of not lying to your audience about the content of your game. And to be honest, and again this just sort of compounds the frustration for me, but it's not an idea that even took me that long to come up with, being as intimately familiar with paranoia as I am. And the Hellblade devs clearly know what that personal experience is worth because they went and actually interviewed people who have psychosis about what psychosis is like as research for the game. But the impression that I get from all the missteps and inaccuracies is that they were more concerned about asking about the specifics of what psychosis was, its symptom set, and didn't really think to consult the same people about how these would be represented in the game. I might be wrong, but I don't feel as though anyone with a psychotic disorder had any actual design input into the game, and I think if they had, the game wouldn't have made the missteps that it did. Ninja Theory understood that first-hand experience of the subject matter was important, but they didn't take it far enough. Maybe because I guess they figured game design was their job, or maybe they did think that they perfectly understood this thing they'd never experienced just because they'd had it explained to them. It's a trap we all fall into, I know I have. I don't really know and I don't really want to speculate, but whichever way you cut it, it points to a troubling lack of insight. And I think that bears mentioning given that, let's be honest, the game's kind of lauded for its insightfulness. But even though I've spent upwards of 20 minutes, Jesus Christ, I need to work on sanding these down. But even though I've spent 20 minutes listing off everything Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice got wrong, I can't really condemn the game for any of it. In fact, I bloody love the thing. Yeah, its representation is very flawed in places, but I don't think it's causing any damage so much as it is symptomatic of damage that already exists. And overall, I do count Hellblade's existence as a step forward. And the only reason I've spent so much time criticising it is because I think it's worth building on. And I get the impression from playing the game that the people who made it are the kind of people who will listen. Because, I mean, they asked us in the first place. Now that might sound like it should just be common sense for the purposes of research, but I'm not kidding, a lot of people wouldn't bother, because that would require having respect for the agency of neurodivergent people, and that's something that a lot of people, up to and including actual healthcare professionals, just don't have. But the creators of Hellblade clearly do have respect for our agency. And that's not just evident in their actions, it's evident in the protagonist they've created. Senua might be one of the strongest characters I've ever seen in a video game, if not the strongest. Because she's strong in a way that's more meaningful than just being some typical Hollywood badass. It's not that she isn't struggling, it's not that she isn't afraid, she's terrified. Because her situation is terrifying and that's a natural fucking response. She's not stoic, she's not confident, and in most instances she has very little control over her situation. But she will keep getting back up, despite all of that, and do what needs doing because she understands that she has to. Even if it's unfair, even if it seems impossible, that's irrelevant to her. Because whether it's unfair, unpleasant, terrifying, or downright impossible, it's what needs to happen for her to move forward. And so she does it. She's not empowered. She's powerful. When a lot of games try and tackle mental health, they just lazily depict it as a sanity meter, and it's game over when that meter reaches 0. Because how could someone with poor mental health possibly do anything of value? Hellblade is like the polar opposite of that. Senua's sanity meter is at 0 throughout pretty much the entire experience, and she's getting the fuck on with it. And to me, that one thing completely outweighs everything that Hellblade gets wrong. Because if you respect someone's agency, that equips you to start listening to them. And then the people listening can be told what other parts are wrong and which aren't. Everything else can be corrected as long as they have that one crucial bit of core understanding. The Hellblade devs had that core understanding, and they listened. I mean, yeah, they evidently thought they were in a better position than they actually were to communicate what they had been taught, but they listened. They're a little confused, but they get it. Yes, in many respects, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice feels like it's the product of a neurotypical mind. But it's a neurotypical mind that would apologise upon being told what it got wrong. And that's not just important, it's rare. Depressingly so. And if playing this game can get through to people and instill that quality in them, I can forgive everything else. Because while it may only have gotten step 1 right, so many games fail to even do that. I'm incredibly happy that Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice exists, It's a great game, it's an important game, and especially with it being a bigger budget, more high profile endeavour, I feel confident in saying that this game is a great step forward for representations of mental health in gaming, and improving ideas about psychosis and psychotic disorders in the popular consciousness. But for that to happen, other people need to build on what Hellblade did. Works need to come out that fix the problems that Hellblade had and create an experience that's truer to life, to create understanding in the way that Hellblade set out to do. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is an outstanding work in its own right, but more than that, it has provided a strong, solid foundation for representation of psychosis in gaming, one that I feel was sorely needed by the medium. But there is undeniably more work that needs to be done. But thanks to Hellblade and Ninja Theory, if anyone else now wants to step up to the plate and do that work, they know that they can, they know that it's viable, and they can make their money back in 3 months without selling a single microtransaction. Anyway, just thought that was worth mentioning.